Welcome to Gina Lento's Session 5 video presentation on corporate greed. First, let's have a look at what was different about corporate greed in the 21st century. Then we'll see what current financial practices are sailing a bit close to the wind. It's interesting to do an analysis of the national debt in this context and ask, is it really any different to the smoke and mirrors game of, say, an Enron? Finally, we would not be good candidate leaders without attempting some forethought about what could be the next global financial crisis and take stock of what we might do to prevent complete disaster. So here are some household names of the biggest corporate scandals of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Enron, Global Crossing, Bear Stearns and Countrywide Bank, Fruit of the Loom, West Point, of course, Mike Milken, the junk bonds king, and Bernie Madoff, the guy who pulled off the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. Now, looking at two of these cases, Fruit of the Loom and West Point Stevens, Lawrence, in his book, attributes the massive scale of these financial failures to the lack or the reduction of proper control of either civic processes or cultural norms. But I think this thought can be generalized to other cases as well. If we look at two of these cases, Enron and the subprime mortgage scandal, we see that they share elements in common, and in fact, the lack of sufficient regulatory controls, the relaxation of industry norms, and departure from cultural standards of truth in reporting were at the core of their corporate deceit. They were also both aided in their speculative practices by complicit banks who either didn't question incomparable finance reporting or in fact created adaptive banking practices to accommodate these very high-risk, exotic financial assets that the companies were trading. Comparing the leaders of those fantastic failures, it's easy to see how their behavior roundly contradicts the approach to authentic leadership described by Northouse. Following George's model, Northouse listed 5 basic characteristics of authentic leadership. Authentic leaders have a strong sense of purpose, strong values about the right thing to do. They build and maintain trusting relationships with others. They act with self-discipline in alignment with those values, and they have an important moral compass, an intact moral compass that allows them to always be mindful of situations of others. Obfuscating accounting practices and increasingly complex exotic financial products do not indicate a clear sense of purpose, other than greed, which is not a strong value about the right thing to do. Nor did they build trusting relationships with others. Continually overflating the company value does not show self-discipline, and predatory lending can hardly be described as empathetic to borrowers. So in light of these egregious and widespread damages caused by this constellation of scandals, Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002. This created stricter oversight for corporate accounting and heavier penalties for infractions. And then they also passed the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, which, among other things, established the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Now, 15 years on, the consensus is that Sarbanes-Oxley has largely achieved its goals. But 10 years into Dodd-Frank, what has been seen as success is now being threatened by moves to relax the regulatory requirements for some banks. But scandals of different types continue to emerge. Reflecting on the lethal safety failures and environmental pollution cover-ups of these airline and automotive companies, one economic scholar questions whether justice can ever keep up with corporate sin. Looking at some modern dodgy practices of a strictly financial nature, it would be imprudent to ignore the potential dangers posed by spoofing, aka flash crashes, and the use of cryptocurrency. Now, spoofing is the practice of traders placing orders for commodities or securities that they have no intention of executing. So this has the effect of deceiving other traders as to the true demand and supply, which in turn affects pricing moves, and then the spoofers leverage those pricing moves for further financial gain. Cryptocurrency, familiar to many by the trade names, one of the first trade names of Bitcoin, is defined as any virtual representation of value that can be used as a form of currency. Now, it's supposed to be encrypted to secure the transactions, but it's important to note that there is really only incipient regulation for cryptocurrency, and there's great debate about which agencies should track that and control the use of cryptocurrency. And now, cryptocurrency takes the evolution of currency one step further. Graduating from a barter system, the world began to use commodity-based currency, such as gold. But because larger and larger amounts of gold were too heavy to carry and not easily conveyed, we all agreed to use fiat money, fiat currency, in the form of paper bills. Now, the paper bills don't have any intrinsic value in and of themselves. It only has value because we agree that these pieces of paper have a value and it can be used for tradable goods. Cryptocurrency takes that one step further in that there's not even any tangible item that is traded. It's just a series of strings of ones and zeros on computers that keep track of trades. Now, Gideon Mark, in his review of spoofing and cryptocurrency for the Notre Dame Law Review, warns of the potential issues that both of these could cause to lead to global financial disaster. He prescribes a 7-point list of recommendations to prevent it, but it remains to be seen whether we will take heed of his warning. So that brings us to a quick look at the concept of behind the national debt. One could argue that the national debt is not different than cryptocurrency, except that the national debt is negotiated in US dollars, for which a value is set and regulations exist to control its use. The way national debt works is the U.S. Treasury issues IOUs in the forms of T-bills, bonds, and other securities, and the Fed, among others, including foreign central banks, agrees to purchase those securities and gives money to the Treasury to spend. It's effectively taking money from one federal pocket and putting it into the other. But then when it's time to pay off the debt, the U.S. Treasury literally prints the money and gives it to the Fed to cancel the national debt. Now, how fundamentally different is this practice from Enron's fabricated earnings? The obvious difference is that the Fed and the Treasury are working for the greater good of smooth financial operations for the benefit of the entire country. But I think you'll find some that might debate this point. So what might be the next global financial crisis? Well, in 2018, one J.P. Morgan trader predicted that passive investment and algorithmic trading, known as machine trading, would be the root of the next crisis. In 2019, a prominent member of the British Board of Governors of the English Central Bank said the world was sleepwalking into the next financial crisis by failing to address known weaknesses in the global financial system and continuing to reflect on the fact that corporate leaders that perpetrated these scandals have not really been held accountable for their roles in them. Very few have been held accountable. But these predictions were all made prior to the COVID-19 global pandemic. And while infectious disease experts have suggested for years that there could be a potential novel infection that would cause a global pandemic, the world certainly didn't conceive of nor prepare for what has occurred in 2020 or the economic impact that it has had. So it might be best to prepare for the unknowable future by starting with ensuring a widespread return to the approaches and practices of authentic leadership and servant leadership. The development of authentic leadership, with its 5 basic principles noted earlier, has taken off largely in the aftermath of these scandals of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. But servant leadership is a practice that's been advocated since the time of Christ. Notable tenets of servant leadership are always putting others first, helping followers to grow and succeed, behaving ethically, empowering others, and creating community. These should be the fundamental starting points for anyone considering not only a leadership position, but also for anyone wishing to remain a contributing member of a functional community. God intended for us to live in community with each other and perpetual stewardship of the community and well-being of its members. must remain of primary concern to all. By definition, there is a difference between the roles of leaders and followers, but that difference should not constitute a detrimental inequity. Vigilance to this idea ensures a firm grounding in the fundamentals of civility, democracy, and truth. With this foundation, other leadership approaches facilitate collaborative practices and egalitarian empowerment, and can be developed as needed. In this way, ethical decision-making should become the standard. With this set of skills, the leaders that be have the best chance of foreseeing whatever financial disaster might be the next crisis. And with that, I thank you for the privilege of your time.